Welcome to Writing the Wrong Way, the podcast for writers who strive to be bold and readers who crave something new. I'm your host, Jonathan Ball. I want to thank you for being here, and I want us to stay in touch. So subscribe to this podcast, then go to writingthewrongway.com and enter your best email to receive the Martian Embassy Missive, my bi-weekly newsletter where I let you know what's happening on Mars, where we're always making big plans. Join the Martians so you don't get left out of the invasion at writingthewrongway.com. And as a special bonus, I'll send you a free book. Speaking of books, my new book is called The National Gallery, and it contains sonnets about Leatherface from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, elegies lamenting the death of my iPhone, and other strange missives from yours truly, the Poet Laureate of Hell. Visit thenationalgallery.ca to order your signed copy. That's thenationalgallery.ca. I'm talking to Saleema Nawaz, the author of Songs for the End of the World, and a number of other books, including Bone and Bread, which was a finalist for Canada Reads, and a short story collection, Mother Superior and Other Stories. And Saleema, we've known each other for quite some time now, but before we get into that, there's no sense burying the lead. I might as well ask you about the pandemic that we're in when you're releasing a pandemic novel. So can you talk just a little bit about what kind of what has transpired, for lack of a better way to put it, and kind of how, you're here with this book, sort of in this uncertain scenario that you, in some respects, predicted inside this book, and in other ways,
Right.
I think many people are making much of the similarities between what's happening now and what's happening in the book. And while that's interesting, I think it would be nice to kind of get a bit of a sense of what are the differences. What's your book compared to, the outside world?
Yeah, good question. I feel like at the beginning of the pandemic, I was sort of preoccupied with, how things were lining up in reality as compared to the book. Probably like too preoccupied in a sense, because I was never I was never trying to predict anything. Like it's just a novel, but I was sort of like looking at things happening and evaluating them along this framework of like, oh my gosh, did I get it right or did I get it wrong? Forgetting that, of course, that's the wrong framework because, I wasn't trying to predict anything. And then sort of, a bunch of weeks in, I felt like finally I was sort of letting go of looking at reality through the lens of the book. I was finally just dealing with this crazy reality we're living in, and I wasn't sort of seeing everything through the lens of the novel.
Can you outline briefly just what the lens of the novel is, for people who maybe haven't read the book yet or don't have a full sense of it? Can you just talk a bit about what's the situation in this book, and that, versus sort of the situation outside of the book?
Yeah. Thank you. So Songs for the End of the World, it's the interconnected stories of a handful of people who are living through the beginning of a pandemic. And sort of, one of the coincidences is that in my novel, it is a novel coronavirus called Aramis, which is, sweeping across the globe. It has, I guess, a similar, incubation period or whatever. So those are some of the things that, as we were getting ready to publish it, that the publisher was, rightfully concerned about, in terms of what was happening with COVID-19.
It must have felt surreal to sort of see things developing in 2020, because you didn't write the book in 2020 at all, really, is my understanding. I mean, because I remember you talking about this book a number of years ago, and at that point, it must have been 2013, 2014 when you were starting on it, correct? I think it was 2013 you actually started writing it. You wrote basically in 6 years, right? 2013 to 2019 is when you're writing and editing primarily. If I recall correctly, you were more or less done your editing in 2019.
Yeah, absolutely.
But then, starting to see maybe the glimmer of this thing approach.
Yeah, I think it was just a few weeks after the copy edits were finalized that we were sort of hearing about it. I think it was like, I think I finished the copy edits in November. And so then, the text was set. And then it was sort of like in December, I might have this wrong, but I feel like it was in December we were sort of hearing about this virus going around. So yeah, nothing in the text actually, changed as a result of these world events.
It's so interesting because, and I think maybe people make too much of how interesting it is in a certain sense.
Yeah.
But it is just sort of interesting how, this thing is unfolding in the novel in 2020. You're sort of planning. I mean, it makes sense. You're thinking, well, the book's going to be out in 2020. It's set in the present day, more or less. So it makes sense for you to kind of be doing that move. But then, when things started lining up like that, how did it feel to kind of start to see these things lining up in this way? In terms of like, what was sort of because at the same time this is all happening to you in this professional arena, I mean, you're also just like trying to live life in Montreal, which, in Canada is one of the kind of worst hits that this virus has taken.
Yeah. Yeah, we're sort of the epicenter here.
Yeah. It just must have been a very strange and surreal experience. How have you found yourself? How have you been coping with it? I mean, everybody's been coping with this differently and having, has had to cope with it. But I feel like in some ways you've had this other level of having to cope with it.
Yeah, I don't know if it is another level. I think maybe at the very beginning it was, but now I really feel like, it's a cliche at this point, but we are all in this together. And I don't know if you're experiencing this, but I feel like it really comes in waves, in terms of like, okay, you're kind of coping pretty well, and then you're not coping so well, and then maybe you're coping a bit better. But at the very beginning, it was sort of, it felt very lonely because I'd been working on this book, and these events were happening, and my editor was like, everyone at the publisher was tracking what was happening quite closely. And, I just felt very, I guess, alone with the fact that I had this book, that I had so much to say about what was happening. But the book wasn't out yet, of course. And most people I know didn't know what I'd been working on, like to that degree of detail, because I've been writing it for so long.
For a while there too.
Well, yeah, I mean,
I know a fair amount about it, but I didn't know a lot of the detail about it. And I was talking to you about it fairly regularly still. And that's just that's a normal thing when you're working on stuff. Often for people, you just don't want to talk about a bunch of things because it's changing all the time. Yeah.
I mean, I would say you're probably one of, 3 people who know more, who knew more about it than anybody. But it's still like when you have this big unwieldy novel, when you're talking about it, or you're, in my case, complaining about trying to finish it or edit it, then you're not really getting into the nitty gritty of like what it's about. It's just, there's too much to sort of relay to anybody. And, I was talking about it as a plague novel for a long time. But
you were talking about it as a science fiction novel for a long time. And in some respects, it is a science fiction novel still, in a certain technical sense.
Sure.
But in many respects, so many of the quote-unquote science fictional elements have just tipped over into the real world in a way that I think people have maybe... I think people find surprising and interesting. I find it what to me is the most surreal aspect of it all, just personally speaking, is you've got a character in this novel, Owen, who is a writer who's written a pandemic novel that then has become is now in the situation of being in this pandemic, talking about this novel. It seems almost to me that's weirdly the most prescient aspect of it. It's like you're now in this situation that Owen sort of was in some respects. Like that must be an odd. Can you just talk about that character in particular and like how you kind of put that, why and how you put that character in, and sort of some of the things that went into developing that particular a writer character, because I find it interesting personally when writers write about writers, and just some of the challenges that has of trying to create a character who is not just kind of ring true as a writer for, say, writers reading it, but also is interesting for a reader who maybe isn't a writer. Like, there's always like a challenge with that kind of character of having making that process interesting and not talking about it too much, in the way that maybe you might just naturally want to, because as a writer you're interested in it, but then like not making it ring false. And then you got the whole other weird layer of like this person in public talking about this pandemic, having written this pandemic novel, and now here you are strangely in a similar position.
I mean, that definitely is I think the weirdest part, or the weirdest, the most uncanny coincidence, I suppose you could say, from the novel. I'm not sure I'm not sure what to say about him.
Well, in what ways? I mean, he's not necessarily a character that you may want to relate to, but here you are in a position where I think you must relate to him in a number of respects. And so I'm curious to know, like, your kind of perspective on, your relationship with that particular character.
Right. Yeah. Well, one thing that was kind of interesting in terms of like the intersection of fiction and reality was that, at the beginning of this, I was conscious of kind of Owen's behaviors in the novel, which are very, very self-protective and very, I don't want to say paranoid, because he was probably, acting prudently from a self-preservation standpoint, but, he sort of, he buys a lot of supplies. He doesn't leave his apartment at all. He looks into how to get away from people in general. And so I think at the beginning I was sort of like trying not to not buy too many packages of pasta, because I didn't want to be too much like him. Like, I didn't want to be somehow following in the footsteps of what he does in the novel. Just because, as you said, he is sort of a problematic character in some ways. Although I do identify with him, to a certain degree, as a writer, and in the way that, a writer relates to all their characters on some level.
I found myself in, thing when the toilet paper fanaticism was taking hold, scoffing at it, like, oh, what a stupid thing to be doing. And then, at a certain point, I'm looking at the toilet paper dwindling. And like, I'm still scoffing at it, but it was sort of like one of those weird things where I just started to feel like, even though I was pointedly trying not to react emotionally in a way, I in a sense, I think I was just resisting in an emotional fashion, and it's a curious. I mean, it's always, as a novelist or writing fiction, getting into a character's heads, you're trying to kind of think of how they would react to scenarios. And so I feel like, in some respects, to me, you in some ways seem like perhaps the most prepared person in the world to deal with the situation of a pandemic, having, in a sense, rehearsed it for 6 years in your mind. Although I'm sure you don't feel like that, on a day-to-day basis. But has it helped you in any way, like having written this book, to get a perspective on the scenario? Just having done the research, having looked into the science, having kind of rehearsed emotionally, like how people would or should or could react to these sorts of scenarios, or is there a way in which was helpful now?
I'm not. I'm not
just
sure.
Make you more paranoid because the science?
I mean, I think there's probably more. Like, so at the beginning, I was I think quite frustrated with myself for not feeling more prepared. I I remember getting together with some friends at the end of January, around Lunar New Year, and we were talking about the pandemic. We were talking about my novel. These are two close writer friends, and and they were saying, Saleema, what should we do? I was like, well, I mean, if we were smart, we would all stock up on N95 masks and da-da. But, at that point, people were already, hoarding them. And I felt, and then, in March, I was just feeling so frustrated with myself for not having like you just don't know when the right time is to do something. Like, it's really hard to evaluate, risk and like hypotheticals, like I just didn't know when the right day was to pull my daughter out of daycare, and just sort of agonizing over it. And I mean, I'm still agonizing over these questions in terms of like, what to do in the fall or whatever. But, if you look at the risk and you have to, make your own decision about your comfort level with certain risks. And I don't know. I'm not sure that much more knowledge makes those answers clearer in the current situation. I know definitely like people in my extended family think that I'm more paranoid, like I'm overly concerned about, risks of infection, or distancing based on like my research. I don't know. I think maybe like it makes me more able to sort of sift through, the news stories, to a certain degree.
Now putting,
when they were saying don't wear a mask, I was like, well, clearly it would be prudent to just wear a mask, if we're not sure, even if there's no like concrete proof yet of, aerosolized transmission, like let's just be safe and wear a mask.
Now, putting some of the pandemic to the side for a second, one thing that was really interesting to me about the development of this book, just having, as you say, like having talked to you and having a bit of an inside, sense of some of your process, I was really interested I'm really interested to hear you talk about the structure that you arrived at for this book, in terms of how you kind of laid the narrative out with these different time periods, because I know that correct me if I'm wrong, but my memory is that this was at one point a collection of short stories.
That's correct. That is how it began.
And for quite some time, you were talking about it as a short story collection that you were putting together that would have this, kind of pandemic SF sort of element. I can't remember. I thought you had a plan at one point to set it in a farther future. I may be wrong about that, but I was wondering if you could just talk about the kind of early version of it in this more short story collection form, and sort of how it transited into the current novel with its particular structure, and just some of the ways that happened and some of the kind of decisions you made along that way. Yeah.
So, I mean, it began with me looking at the few short stories I had that I had never placed anywhere or had never been published, and then kind of imagining more stories I could write that would connect those short stories to have like an interconnected collection. And that was when I came up with the idea of this sort of plague that was going to be set in the future, not the distant future, but at the time it was distant, like 7 years hence. But of course, just kept creeping closer through the writing and editing process. So I think at that point I had like 7 stories, and then I sort of came up with the idea of 7 more. And that was what I proposed, like as part of a grant proposal, I think in 2012. And so then I just started trying to write those stories that would connect those other stories. So some of those were like additional stories that use some of the characters from the completed stories. And some were sort of new stories, new characters, I mean. And then I'm not sure, at a certain point, it just seemed like it wanted to be a novel, I think was kind of the feeling. Like once the thing was done.
So you had drafted the whole thing as a sort of more disparate, like connected stories, but a bit more isolated or disconnected.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then you looked at it, and at that point, started to feel that maybe it was just needed more cohesion in terms of an overarching narrative. Is that sort of more or less the trajectory?
Yeah. Yeah.
Remember what made you think that? Like, what made you feel like it needed that additional cohesion?
Yeah. That's a good question. I feel like it might have been, I had, 2 readers at that point, and it was I believe, I could be wrong, I believe it was something that they both said to me. And even at that point, I would say I didn't really truly understand the degree of revision like that would entail. Because I didn't sort of realize at that point, like, oh, okay, like you have however many characters. Like at that point, I probably had even more characters than are in the final novel. And, all of those, let's say a dozen characters that all have their own individual little arcs or like moments that happen in one chapter, like now, or maybe they don't have an arc. They just appear in one chapter. It's a moment in time in their life. Now they all need to have sort of character arcs across, the whole novel that weren't there before, which is a huge undertaking, especially when you didn't plan it that way in the first place.
I remember you finding the editing process to be. I think this is a common experience where you're, let's say you do a draft. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but like my imagination is, you're like, you've got this draft. People are telling you, well, it'd be nice. You're so close to having a novel in some ways. It's same characters popping in and out. You got the same stuff happening in the background. They're all kind of connected anyway. Why don't you just make it a novel? And in your head, I'm sure you're like, oh yeah, why not just make it a novel? But then when you start doing it, of course, you realize, well, short stories collections are not novels. There's a whole other architecture. As you say, there's just technical problems like that you already pointed out of how you got to treat character arcs differently and so on. And yet now you've in your head you've committed now to it being a novel, and you can see. I'm sure as you're going through it. I don't know if you have this experience, but what I find when I'm getting in editing, often what I'll find is like I'm making changes that are making the thing substantially better. And at the same time, I'm dismayed that it's making them better because it means I have to keep making further changes that I can start to that I didn't anticipate. But now I'm starting to see, almost like, oh, I thought it was, 70% done, but really it's 30% done.
Right.
And then you feel like you're in kind of a strange sort of quicksand where you are improving everything and everything is getting better. It just is, you're getting deeper and deeper into not being able to go back.
Right. I can imagine that scenario. I don't think that was really.
You were more optimistic about it.
My experience. No, I think I was more blinkered, like more in the dark. Like I think if I had known like how long the road would be, I probably would have gotten discouraged. Like I think I was just kind of looking one step ahead like the whole time, and it probably would have been useful for me to have a bigger vision of the editing process like early on, but I just didn't. I don't know what to say.
It's funny you say that because one thing I flagged when I was reading in an earlier part of the book is just Owen saying I flagged it here to actually maybe read it to you and ask you about it. But it's kind of, you just brought it up in some ways you've got this quote. I can't tell you the page number because I'm not looking at a print book, but I've got this quote in the first Owen section. Stopping to think about things is part of the problem. He was sure it was why he couldn't write faster. There was something a little bit down. It jumps to, there was something counterintuitive about needing to be less thoughtful in order to be a successful writer. But it's true. It is part of that process. Is you have to kind of walk a weird line between being very thoughtful, and in your case, thinking through what are the actual scientific possibilities of what may or could happen in this kind of a scenario, and additionally, how might people act or react in those scenarios, which gets into psychology, which gets into kind of your thinking about your own points of view on human nature or your own experience, but also is so there's that need to be thoughtful in numerous respects. But also, plus just having to have something to say, right, from a philosophical or point of view in order to kind of want to write the story. But then there's also like the problem of, as Owen kind of points out there, you kind of have to stop thinking so much in order to get anything done in a day.
Yeah.
And finish.
I think that was done. What he says there was probably my mindset at the time, which I think sometimes is, useful. You do need to, you can't think about, the audience or the final product. You just have to kind of put your head down and write sometimes. However, I think that some forethought is useful and probably pays for itself. I've been listening to this podcast, to some of your previous episodes about editing, and I've been taking them to heart. And trying to spend more time pre-planning on future projects.
Well, I have a very stringent editorial approach at this point, but it's simply because I've had such a non-stringent one for so long, and I feel like I've just made every possible mistake. But I just did it very fast. Like, I was doing so much stuff because I was a full-time writer for a while in university because I had so many scholarships. And I was just, I wrote like 10 books, 12 books. Not that I published those books, but, I feel like I made a lot of mistakes really fast. And I sat with a source story. The book that I've got coming out next has a short story in it, which took me, I think, 8 solid years to write.
Oh, wow. Which one?
It's called Explosions.
Okay. I was going to guess that. Yeah.
Yes.
I guess maybe that's in.
You might have seen early drafts of it, but in any case, the point is simply that in just trying to get that stupid thing to work, I feel like even just that one story, I made like 1,000. I tracked what I was doing in almost a spreadsheet way.
Yeah.
Just because I was just so frustrated by that point. It was like a feeling like I just don't know if I'm making things better or worse. I'm just going to start tracking whether an editing change makes stuff better or worse. And I kind of stumbled into an editing approach that I don't know if it would work for everybody, but it's like I feel like a lot of writers have this issue with editing for good reasons, that they're not necessarily editors, right? They can be very good at it. But there is this. I've heard you talk about this in different ways before, but there is a sort of part of the process which, it helps to really examine, but in some ways you can examine it to death and kind of paralyze yourself by just thinking too much, right? But I just want to jump back to the editing, or not to editing,
right.
but when you started. How did you settle on the idea that you had to proceed in this to end up with a draft that was not proceeding in a clear chronological fashion? When you made the decision to do the time jumping, which you've got a whole little schematic of at the start of the book. When did you kind of settle on that, and what was some of your thinking around that structure?
Yeah, well, that was it. Definitely came about. Probably, I don't know, maybe halfway through the editing process with an editor. So, the book had already been accepted. I was working with an amazing editor, Anita Chong, at McClellan and Stewart. And the way that we had been working was a way that she had taken, I think, on a few previous books, because she had worked on a couple other books that had a similar structure of kind of interconnected stories or different threads. And that was how we had started editing it, was by the discrete threads of like groups of characters. So for instance, we started with the Emma chapters because originally it was chronological, and the story, there's a story on the boat, which is right now it's about midway through the book, I think. It's at the midway point, but previously it was the first story, because it happens around, Y2K. And it's like with Emma when she's a child with her sister on a boat. So originally that was the first story, or chapter, I should say. And so we would sort of work strand by strand. So we would do all of the, Emma chapters, and then all of the Elliot chapters. But I think, like in retrospect, like I think that approach makes sense. But given, I don't know, just given certain things with this manuscript, it was actually harder for me to work that way, because the original structure just created certain expectations. Like when it began on the boat with the two sisters, there's this expectation you're going to hear about both sisters. And this was something that a couple early readers had said, they're interested in this other sister. And this is, I think, maybe where I was just maybe not really listening to my own interests or instincts on this, because I was really not interested in the other sister ever. But I was like, okay, well, let's see what happens. Like, let's see, like, I'm interested to try any suggestion, if it's going to make the book better. So I would write, I'd go away and I would write a bunch of chapters for this other sister. But then they just, they weren't really working. And maybe because I was just kind of writing, I was not thinking. I was just sort of blindly writing, without really a good plan in place of, how does it really relate to the themes of the novel, to the overall plot of the novel. So there was a lot of these, editing process was really just a lot of writing and discarding, like versus just like editing the text, which is in the book now. And so at a certain point, I think it came out of this sense of like, like my difficulty with these Emma chapters and like discarding these chapters about her sister, and then just being like, what if it doesn't start on the boat? Like, what if it starts with, the inherent drama of like the pandemic starting, and having these be flashbacks. And that was a really big, breakthrough. And in some sense, it's like, it's not rocket science, because like many, many literary novels are structured this way. Maybe even like most of them in a sense that use flashbacks. Like you have a kind of present tense or like present scenario that's unfolding, and then you kind of have flashback chapter. Like that's very, very common. So yeah, anyway, at a certain point we arrived at that, and it was great. And it was like a huge, I'm not sure if it arrived maybe from writing the first Elliot chapter, which I didn't imagine as a first chapter when I wrote it, I think. But then after writing it, it was like, oh, actually this would be a really good first chapter.
It's a good chapter as a first chapter, especially insofar as I think it's one of the best. I was very impressed by how you introduced the situation of him learning of the pandemic, because it's sort of the reader's intro. So just to kind of follow up on something you were talking about, where in your earlier version you had these two sisters on this boat, and then people were kind of thinking, well, if you got two, then we're going to learn about both of them. I find that is the kind of algebra that is very hard to do in the editing process, but is very important, because I feel more and more as I like write and edit, especially, I feel like a lot of writing is a sort of information management, where as the writer you have all this information about what is about the story. You have more information than the reader has when they begin the story, obviously, and you're parsing it out in particular ways. What I find is a big problem that writers have especially younger writers or newer writers, let's say, is they just don't have the information management skills and so they have a tendency to dump information out, for example, or they just aren't necessarily aware of what information they're giving out. People are going to pay attention to. So if you're giving out 5 pieces of information, there's this assumption sometimes that writers have, which is that, the reader now knows 5 new things. They will pay attention to all 5 of those new things. But that's not the case, right? It depends. And there's the other problem of what information are you even aware that you're giving them?
Yeah.
Right. And I'm sure you've had this experience of going back into your draft, and then there's stuff in there you don't remember putting in there. Like just plotting. What I always track, what are characters carrying? Because I'll find like they pick up, somebody picks up something, and then like later on they need something. Sometimes I've forgotten that they already have it in their pocket.
Right.
You'll have like those sorts of weird things happening. So to me, that's an interesting example of like a scenario where a reader is sort of paying attention to something that maybe you weren't initially paying attention to, but it makes perfect sense, right? And then but when you start to restructure and you get the final form out, now you've got a scenario where you have the information that there's this pandemic, and the culture hasn't really grasped the information yet in the novel. This character, Elliot, hasn't been paying attention, right? How are we going to introduce both him and the reader to this wider issue? It's a very clever solution that you came up with, I found. I don't know if you want to talk too much about the particulars of that. It is very early on, so I don't know if it's a spoiler per se, but I thought it was a very elegant solution that has like a big emotional impact and is the kind of event that would really overturn a person's personal life. And now all of a sudden he's in a quarantine, and it just is a very. I found it was a very interesting way to kind of get the premise of here's how people are going to be immediately impacted and have sort of their lives turned upside down in these particular emotional ways, while just getting the information to the reader that in 2020 there was this, this thing happened. Now when I jump back to 2009 or 2004, what have you, you're going to read it knowing that has already happened.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's like thinking about it, I think it's typical that, it wasn't initially written to be a first chapter. Like, I think if I had been thinking about it as a first chapter, I might not have been able to, it would have become
you would have started
too complex of a problem. Yeah, exactly. Right. Like it wouldn't have been an elegant, whatever way of introducing it. It just, but anyway, well, I'm glad it works where it is.
I think it works really well, but I think it's in a weird way. I think it probably, I don't know if this is advice that anyone could use, but I feel like in a weird way, it probably solved a problem you would have maybe otherwise had, which is feeling like, I think often people have this problem in the first few chapters, and why people obsessively rewrite the first few chapters without continuing their books often, is, they have all this information and they're trying to figure out what does the reader need in these first few chapters. They always overestimate. I think as writers, we just tend to think we want to get to certain things faster because we think the reader needs X, Y, and Z, when really they just need X. And it's sort of, it sounds like the process, as much as it probably caused you some grief to go through this particular process, and it sounds like it's in some ways solved a number of problems in an elegant fashion.
Yeah. I mean, it also created its own, the other thing about the structure of a novel like this is that it is kind of, endlessly modular, because there's so many characters, and different timelines. You constantly have this ability to like add or take away, but every, change has all of these, cascading, changes that have to, consequences that come out of that. And So, one of the consequences of starting the book with Elliot was that, there is this sense that he's the protagonist in a way, which, he was never originally the protagonist. And then it was sort of like, okay, well, I need to, if he is the protagonist and we're kind of following him in a sense, and he was sort of useful to follow because he's sort of on the ground. He's a first responder, so he's seeing a lot of what's going on in New York City. So I had to write more material for Elliot than I had originally imagined.
The other thing I like about the process you're describing, although I don't necessarily recommend parts of, I recommend a really particular editing process to people, but when in the drafting process, I really love to recommend the kind of thing you were doing, which is you've got an idea, well, why don't you write some stuff and try it out? I find people are very resistant to that idea for some bizarre reason that I've never understood. Whereas something I always admired about your approach is that you will just do you'll have 2 ideas and you'll write both those ideas out to see if they are any good. It's such a weird thing that writers don't do that more often, to me. I'll have writers come to me and say, I just don't know if this person should, when they get proposed to, I don't know if they should accept the proposal or not. And I'm stuck.
Yeah.
And I'm always shocked by this because to me, write one version where they accept it and write another where they don't, and then see which one you like better.
Well, I like that
people get this idea in their head, that it has to be, I have to write in a certain way because that's what writers do.
Yeah.
I don't know, I'm not a writer.
Yeah. I mean, I might be just holding to another kind of thing that writers say to themselves, which is I'm not a writer if I'm not writing. So I think sometimes when I'm taking time, there's moments probably where I should maybe take more time to plan. This is my current obsession, to plan or to decide or make a decision, versus just sort of continuing to write. Well, I'll just write that because that way at least I'm writing something.
I think that's
but I think
exactly
you can write your way to an answer, but I do think it sometimes takes longer, maybe. I don't know.
I mean, I think I subscribe to a belief that sort of both. I mean, I try to think and plan more than I used to, and I really recommend certain types of thinking and planning. But I think if you can only do one thing, you should just write. The number one thing to me always is, you gotta, you're a writer. If you're writing, what I always admired about your approach and the way you have done things is you're that same kind of workhorse, to use that kind of unflattering metaphor, perhaps. But you know what I mean? It's that, and so this just goes back a bit. I remember you always sort of being this way in a certain respect, because I forget exactly where we met. Did we meet in Dennis Cooley's class or a different class around that time period?
Oh, we met. Yeah, no, we met in Dennis Cooley's
class. That's what I thought. So that was in 2005, I think it was.
No, that was in 2004, I think.
Okay,
or
so that makes sense.
Maybe even 3.
Yeah, it'd be 3, 4, or 5 because it was during my master's degree. So I can't remember which one it was, but in there. And I think you were also doing your master's at the time, right? Because
but that was the only class we had together.
I think so.
Definitely.
Yeah, and then okay, there you go. And then what you were writing at that time, I remember in the class, seeing a number of your short stories. And some of which made it into your first book. And your master's thesis had story. Was your master's thesis just the white dress story, or was it a couple of different stories, including that one? I'm trying to remember.
It was just the white dress, and then we had to write the critical essay.
Yes, so it was
to accompany it.
That was ended up in your first book, Mother Superior. And can you talk a little bit about what you were doing at that time? So you're sort of how you kind of came to be in that particular program and pursuing this, thesis and writing this, story and so on. Because I think, having, kind of met you then and like following, and seeing like how kind of your career sense, I think it's a kind of to a lot of people, I think you kind of like came out of nowhere and won the Journey Prize. And then all of a sudden you've got a novel out. It's on Canada Reads. Now you got this new book out. I don't think people like see like the kind of 15-year path of that, which, previously, before that, you're doing, even before that, of course, when I met you, you were a very polished writer in many respects, and had clearly been doing it for a long time at that point. And so I'm curious to just sort of know a bit about your quote unquote, early days before I met you, like what you were doing, where your head was at, and why you were kind of pursuing this degree and focusing on writing in this way.
Yeah.
So from your point of view on like how things have been going.
Yeah. Well, so, I mean, I was doing my undergrad at Carleton when I did there was one creative writing class at Carleton, like creative writing workshop. And like, I think like on offer, in the whole university. And I applied for that workshop. I heard about the workshop maybe my second year, and I applied and I didn't get in. And then I applied the next year with there was a different instructor, and did get in. And during that sort of half-year course was sort of when I found out that there were such things as creative writing programs, and that there were such things as literary journals, and that there were such things as the Canada Council and grant programs. And I just learned a tremendous amount in that class, which was with this professor, Rick Taylor. And so from then on, I was like, oh, okay, there are creative writing programs. There are all of these things. I went to the Canada Council website and, found out, okay, if you have 4 short stories published in literary journals, then you're eligible for a grant. I just did not really, this was sort of my first, I guess, exposure to finding out, quote unquote, how to become a writer. I just didn't know how one did it. Like, I always wanted to be a writer from the time I was a kid, but I just didn't really know how to do it. And I couldn't really.
Did you know, you didn't know anyone who was a writer then?
No, I never met a writer. Yeah. And I was sort of like, I was sort of obsessed with Lucy Maud Montgomery, and I just didn't know anything about current writers or how one became one. And I was just constantly frustrated with myself, with my inability to finish anything. I had so many stories that I was writing. I was always trying to write a book, all through elementary school. In grade 6, I felt like I was finally had 60 pages, but then I just couldn't finish it. I just didn't know how. I would lose interest, or I don't know. I didn't have any self-discipline, which seems ridiculous to say now, but
it is.
I didn't even.
It's an odd thing to say now, right? Because if you kind of look back at all the things you're saying, it sounds like you had a lot of self-discipline, but you just didn't know how to finish a story, which is a skill.
Yeah.
But I was in the same boat as you in many respects, and when I look back at myself now, I think, well, there's a guy who was always doing all this work, but just didn't know how, didn't know there was a career here. Yeah. And didn't know how to, well, of course, I remember being frustrated with myself. I couldn't finish a novel. But why would I know how to finish a novel?
Yeah. Well, I think that's where, you can kind of see the difference sometimes in kids whose parents are already working in the field that they want to work in, or in a related field, or who know anything about, that artistic field. They're able to sort of, tell their kids, oh, well, you could try to do, instead of trying to write a whole series of books, why don't you just try to write a story, or do that, or there's ways that I think that talent can be directed and nurtured. But anyways, you don't need to write a book in grade 6. Or I
think you do.
Or,
right?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
you think, or at least maybe people like you and I do, we have this personality trait where we think, well, if I'm not doing X, then that means I'm not Y. It's interesting to hear you talk about like, well, I went to county council and I figure out you have to publish 4 stories and all this stuff. I mean, I forget if that's the rule now, but I remember doing the exact same thing. Like I learned there was a granting agency. I called the granting agency up and I was like, what do I need to do to be eligible for this grant? Because but a lot of people don't do that stuff. And when I look back, like I was trying to do the math of it, you know what I mean? Like in my head, the algebra, not in terms of like, how am I going to make all this money, but just in terms of like, what are the things that will make me a writer? Well, the county council would consider me a writer if this. I looked into like the tax codes. How does a writer file taxes? What would the government consider for me to be a writer? And so on and so forth. It's a weird, but it is. I mean, I grew up in a small town of like 100 people, where as not only did I not know anybody who was a writer, I didn't know anyone who ever met a writer. It just was another world that I read about.
Yeah.
But all the stuff you're reading is like, it doesn't get into the details of being a writer. Even if you're reading about a guy who's a writer, he's battling a werewolf, right? He's not doing his taxes. So it's just anyway. Well,
I think it speaks to like the value of having writers visit high schools, visit classrooms, so that young people can interact with a real writer, because I think it just demystifies it, I think.
What do you think drove you to keep following that path, though? Because, so you say, like, you get on this creative writing course and then you learn all these things. You're talking about it in some respects as if that's a pivotal moment in your life, which I'm sure it was. But to me, there's an invisible moment before that where, you applied in the creative writing course, they rejected you, but then you applied again the next year. A lot of people don't do that. Like their journey ends when they get do you know what I mean? What do you
so the pivotal moment for me was really like as a child. Like it was really like, this is my calling. I'm going to be a writer. Like that was it.
Do you remember a reason for that? Because this is, forgive me, if you get asked this question 100 times, people do like to ask this question, like, what made you want to become a writer, what have you? Do you remember a moment or a reason for that? Because I don't. Like, I just remember that's what I was doing.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I do feel like, okay, that's just what I was doing. Like, I was always making up stories. Like, that would be how I would put myself to sleep at night. Like, from as early as I could remember. But like, I do remember like being in grade 1, like this is the image that always comes to mind when I think about this. In grade 1, we had these like booklets, these little exercise booklets that were sort of the top of the page. I don't know if you had this in school. The top of the page was blank and the bottom of the page was lined, and you would sort of use these to kind of make little books, and you would write some sentences and then you would illustrate like the story that you were writing, or at least this is what we were doing in my class. And I remember just being like really frustrated with having to draw the pictures and just being like, I shouldn't have to do this. Like, I'm the writer. Like, this is the part that I'm interested in. Don't make me.
You're a comic artist.
Don't waste my time with, these pictures that I can't, because I was always so frustrated as a child by my inability to draw what I could see in my head. Like, it was just so frustrating and so embarrassing, I found, I would try to draw something and it would just be like a scribble. And I'm like, this is supposed to be this amazing, whatever. But I could see that it looked like garbage.
It's so funny you say that. I remember those exact same things. And I remember a similar thing, but so I couldn't draw anything either. So I would draw these weird, scribbles and odd forms. And what I would do at the bottom is I would just say, this is the demon, whatever. And I would make up a name because I couldn't draw anything. I would just, but I went to a Christian school, so a grade school. So they would get so frustrated and annoyed with me because I'm like, every entry was like, this is the demon, whatever.
Oh my gosh. That's so on brand for you, Jonathan. That's hilarious.
So eventually I didn't have to do it anymore.
I was just looking at this book. It's a great book by, I don't know if you know the comic artist Elise Gravel.
No.
Anyway, it's this book that's supposed to be like her drawing journal, and it's sort of made to look like a journal. It says, if you find this book, please return to Elise Gravel. Something like that. That's the title. But inside is just like all of these kind of funny things that she likes to draw. And a lot of them are just like, weird monster creatures.
Oh, yes, I did read that book. I do know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah.
Anyway, it was like really enjoyable and a pretty, I think, fun book for kids to just be like, just fun to draw. It doesn't have to, look like a real animal. It could be a demon or a strange monster.
Now, when you moved and you went to the U of M and, you started getting that writing class and we're doing this, degree and everything, at that point where you seemed very on the path. Like that's what me and Gregory Kamichik, who you also met in that class, and me and him were doing a comic together and stuff. But we talked about you. We always use you as an example when we're talking to people of like, Saleema is the one that we, met and we were like, she's the one who's going to make it. Just so because, she just has it like, she's just one of those people who, like isn't going to accept something else happening.
Well, I felt that way about you guys also. I feel like there are a lot of I feel like we have talented writers in that group
in that way. But you seemed like the one who was the most well formed at that point for sure, I think.
Oh, well, that's kind of you. So I joined that.
Well, it's not just kind of
reason.
Me. My question is like, how the hell did you manage to do that? Because people keep asking me how to do that.
Okay.
I'm still trying to figure it out.
I don't know. I mean, so the reason I was in that class, the reason I was in that degree was because so I didn't know about creative writing programs until I was in my third year of university doing, another kind of program, which I was just sort of taking because like my whole MO, so when I was graduating high school and you get to fill out a little thing about your plans for the future that they read as you like cross the stage to take your diploma. And, I'd written on mine, I'm going to go take this, this Bachelor of Humanities at Carleton, and I'm going to become one with the universe because I was training to be a yoga teacher then. And I'm going to write the great Canadian novel. Like this was what I declared at my high school graduation. So I was very determined to do it, even though I had no idea how to do it. And then, did this whole other degree. And then during that degree, I was like constantly, again, frustrated with myself because I'm like, I wasn't doing any creative writing because you don't really have time when you're taking full-time, academic studies. And then, did that, one class after I got rejected the first time, like really concentrated on trying to write some better pieces for the portfolio because I just didn't really have anything that was, recent. And then after that, after I graduated, I moved to Winnipeg and I worked in a video store because I was like, well, all I want to be is a writer. I kind of really felt I was very not practical about it. Rather than thinking what career path would go well with writer. I did to a degree. I was trained as a yoga instructor. I was like, oh, yoga instructor, writer, those go together really well. But I just couldn't handle sort of some of the flakiness to do with some of the yoga practice that I was doing. So I was really this is how I, dedicate myself to becoming a writer. It's I have to just take a crappy job that. Maybe that is just something in the air about this romantic idea of being a writer. And I didn't, want to be super poor and, apply for loan relief on my student loans because I made so little money. They were like, okay, yeah, you don't have to pay them yet. But I just didn't know how else to go about it. I wish, in some ways, I wish someone had told me, oh no, you know what, you can go do a law degree and, become a research lawyer or something, or you can perhaps pursue, some kind of work that is related or adjacent, But I just didn't believe that at the time. But then after a year of trying to like work at the video store and not really make any progress, like I had written a few short stories, I guess, but just not very much. Like I had not really moved the needle very far on like writing a novel or something. So then I was like, I need some external deadline, and then found out there was this MA with a creative thesis option. So I was like, I'm going to apply to that, and hopefully that will force me to write a novel.
Well, it more or less did. I mean, didn't quite get you to the novel, but it got you quite a ways to the first book, the short story collection. And I mean, I think what I like about your approach and kind of, it's very much just that classic approach of, you just keep doing things and not quitting. And I think what distinguishes so many people who want to be writers from people, actually, do it in whatever form, they manage to do it in, is just that, like, how they handle that, those gaps when nothing's happening, or all that's happening is people telling you no. You apply to your creative writing class and they say, no, we don't want you in this class. Yeah. And then instead of, getting this or that or the other thing, you sit, maybe you get angry or something at first, but then, you sit and you do the math of like, okay, well, if this thing's not good enough, then I need a better thing.
Right.
Or, if Canada Council, has money, and to get that money, I need to publish 4 stories, then I better start with writing 4 stories.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like,
exactly. Yeah.
And send them to, 4 places and so on. Like, there's a certain amount of just tenacity that I think is in many ways more important than the talent that a person is, just, or their natural facility for the thing. And, and if you can kind of marry that tenacity to some sort of natural facility or talent, then I think it really, it is hard for people who are looking down on their own stuff to see that what's fundamentally going to matter more than how good a writer they are right now is whether or not they keep trying.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if they just aren't getting through this path, maybe they should try this other path. I sometimes give an example that I had with this short story where I'd written this short story. That short story that you read, it's called Costa Rica Green in the new book, the Costa Rica one. So I'd written that story, and it has a couple. It's a pretty normal story for me, but it has a weird section where, it's like almost this 1-page long dialogue section, right? For that reason and for a couple other small things in it, I could not get that story published anywhere I sent it to. Like, I was sending it to place after place after place. I was living in Calgary at the time doing my PhD. And I was convinced this was a good story. And I was sending it one place after the other, and they were just rejecting it. And by this point, I had published a number of things. I'd never gotten this many rejections for a story that I thought was perfectly publishable. Yeah. And I actually thought when I wrote it, I thought this story is, more publishable than most it's more mainstream than most of the things that I write. Yeah. But I couldn't get it published anywhere in Canada. And I started to like really, wonder, like, maybe I'm wrong, maybe this is no good and so on. But then I had this sort of moment where I was like, well, maybe I shouldn't be sending it around Canada.
Oh, interesting.
For some reason, I don't know. Maybe it's just something to do with the market in Canada right now. So I sent it to Australia. It was instantly published. And then it was shortlisted for an award for the best short story by an Alberta author in Canada.
Okay.
So I just had this moment I was like, it's not them. It's just I was thinking about things wrong. There was something happening that I didn't see. But I was in my track, of thinking, well, if, I got to send, I live in Canada, I better send it to somewhere in Canada. Like, I was in the wrong track and I didn't see it. and so
Interesting.
the tenacity helped, but I was, anyway, the point of the story is just to say, like, I think it's hard for people to get out of like the trap of their thinking. And so one thing I always appreciated with you is like, you'll be like texting me like, oh, I'm so frustrated by this stupid editing process, and this novel's driving me crazy and everything, but yet you're still doing it, like, and you're still like finding a solution. This thing wasn't working, so you tried this other thing. I think it's served you well, and I think you've gotten a good book out of it here. So I hope people pick up the book. It's going to be out when you hear this podcast. Songs for the End of the World is out in print, newly out today. It'll be out in print and audio, I believe, or today or just around today. It should have just come out in print and audiobook form, and has been out for a little while in ebook form as well. Thanks so much, Saleema, for talking to me. And next time, let's get together and talk about potato chips.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
Let's do that.
Great.
And thanks for having me.
Thank you.